I'm going to call myself Captain Reyes for exactly 9 more seconds. Because that's how long it takes a room full of people who think they know your worth to go completely, perfectly silent. My brother, Grant, 41 years old, a man who has spent 2 decades building a private aircraft collection specifically so people would have to look at him, is standing in the middle of his own hangar with his mouth slightly open. Behind him, a man in a Pentagon-issued blazer with a folder tucked under his arm is reading my service record out loud to 60 of Grant's closest friends, business partners, and one very confused caterer. Grant had just finished telling everyone that I was, in his words, the family's little disappointment who liked planes but never did anything with it. He said it with a laugh. He said it like it was fact. He didn't know the man standing 3 feet to his left had flown 2 tours alongside me and had personally signed off on a mission that still, technically, has certain details redacted. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because you need to understand exactly how small this room used to make me feel before you can understand exactly how good it felt to watch it stop. My name is Mara Reyes. I'm 36. And for most of my life, in my own family, I was the footnote. To understand how it got to this moment, Grant standing frozen next to a decorated Air Force liaison officer while 60 guests waited to hear what came next, you have to go back to a kitchen table 19 years ago, where a 14-year-old girl announced she wanted to fly, and got laughed at. Growing up, there were 2 Reyes kids and 1 runway. Grant was always the one people believed in. He was loud, he was charming, he collected model planes before he could tie his shoes, and by the time he was 25 he'd turned a small inheritance from our grandfather into an actual aviation obsession, restored vintage aircraft, a growing hangar outside of Scottsdale, a reputation in collector circles as the Reyes kid with the eye. Our parents loved telling that story. Grant, the visionary. Grant, the one who understood aircraft the way some people understand music. I loved planes too. I just didn't perform it the way he did. I read manuals instead of talking about them at dinner. I applied to the Air Force Academy at 17 without telling anyone, because I already knew what the reaction would be. When I got in, my mother cried, not happy tears. She asked me why I couldn't just support your brother's thing instead of trying to compete with it. I wasn't competing. I just wanted to fly. But in my family, wanting something Grant already claimed as his identity was treated like theft. I served 12 years. Most of it I can talk about. Some of it I still can't, not fully, not the specifics of the mission that would end up mattering so much later, not the names, not the details that are still sitting in a file with more black bars than sentences. What I can tell you is that I flew reconnaissance and later moved into a specialized advisory role working alongside coalition forces, the kind of work where your face never makes the news and your name never makes a press release, on purpose. I was good at it. Genuinely, quietly, undeniably good at it. My commanding officer at the time, Colonel Dave Osei, a broad-shouldered man with a laugh like a door slamming and zero patience for nonsense, used to say I had the coldest nerves and the warmest brain on the whole team. That sentence lived in my head for years, mostly because nobody in my actual family had ever said anything close to it. Grant, meanwhile, kept building his collection. He wasn't a fraud. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me even when I'm telling a story where he's the villain. He genuinely knew aircraft. He'd done the research, funded the restorations, built real relationships with mechanics and historians and other collectors. His hangar became something people flew in from other states to see. But somewhere along the way, being an expert on aircraft turned into believing he was the only person in our family who understood them. And since I never talked about my service, because I legally couldn't, not the parts that mattered, Grant filled that silence with his own story. The story where I'd tried the military thing and it didn't really go anywhere. The story where he was the real aviation person in the family, and I was the sister who liked to pretend. I let him have that story for years. Partly because I couldn't correct it without violating things I'd sworn not to violate. Partly, if I'm honest with myself, because it was easier than fighting for a version of me my own family didn't seem to want. The inciting moment, the one that finally cracked something in me, happened 18 months before that hangar party. Grant had invited a retired two-star general to view a restored aircraft he'd just acquired, a rare piece with a genuinely fascinating service history. I was there, quiet, standing near the back like usual. The general asked a technical question about the aircraft's operational use in a specific overseas campaign, a campaign I actually had first-hand, ground-level knowledge of, knowledge that would have added real color to what he was asking. I started to answer. Grant cut me off, not rudely, exactly, just smoothly, the way you'd redirect a child, and said, "She reads a lot about this stuff, but I'm the one who actually studies it professionally." The general nodded politely and moved on. Nobody noticed. Nobody except my younger sister, Priya, 29, an ER nurse with the specific talent of catching every injustice in a room and saying absolutely nothing about it in the moment, who caught my eye across the hangar and gave me a look that said everything Grant couldn't hear. That was the moment I decided. Not to expose him. Not even, honestly, to punish him. Just to stop protecting a version of events that wasn't true, the next time the truth was actually allowed to speak for itself. The two worlds I was living in couldn't have been more different, and it took me a long time to stop letting the smaller one define me. In one world, the family one, I was the sister who liked planes but never did anything with it, the disappointment measured against Grant's very visible, very photographable success. Every holiday had some version of the same conversation. My mother asking when I was going to settle into something real. My father, gentler but no more helpful, changing the subject whenever my service came up, like it embarrassed him that I hadn't chosen something he could brag about at his golf club the way he bragged about Grant's hangar. In the other world, the real one, I was someone entirely different. I was the officer junior pilots asked to sit in on their debriefs because I noticed things other people missed. I was the one Colonel Osei pulled aside during a particularly brutal stretch of a deployment and told, flatly, "Reyes, when this is over, you're going to end up running something bigger than any of us." I was trusted with operational details that never made it into a report anyone outside a very small clearance circle would ever read. There's a specific kind of respect you earn in a room where nobody's impressed by how you talk about your work, only by how you do it. I had that respect. I just couldn't bring it home with me. Priya started noticing the gap between those two worlds long before I said anything. She'd visit me on leave and ask real questions, not performative ones, actual questions about what I did, what it felt like, whether I was safe. She never pushed past what I could answer. She just made it clear, in small consistent ways, that she didn't believe the family's version of me. Once, at a dinner where Grant was mid-monologue about some new acquisition, she quietly slid her phone across the table to show me an article, nothing classified, nothing that mattered operationally, just a general piece about the specific overseas region I'd served in, with a single text underneath it, "I know you were part of something real there. You don't have to explain it to me." I didn't answer. I just looked at her, and something in my chest loosened for the first time in years. I decided, somewhere in that stretch of time, that I wasn't going to argue with Grant's version of me anymore. Arguing required explaining, and explaining required saying things I wasn't allowed to say. So instead, I decided to let the actual record speak, whenever it was finally allowed to. I didn't know when that would be. I just knew I wasn't going to spend one more decade being quietly erased at my own family's dinner table. The opportunity arrived in a strange, almost mundane way. About 2 years after I transitioned out of active service into a liaison role, advising on a specific interagency project, still adjacent to people who'd known my full record, I got a call from Colonel Osei, retired by then but still deeply connected, letting me know he'd be attending a regional aviation gathering in Scottsdale. My stomach dropped when he mentioned the venue. It was Grant's hangar. Grant had apparently, through his ever-expanding collector network, ended up on a guest list that included several current and former defense officials interested in one particular aircraft in his collection, a restored piece with a documented, specific operational history from the very campaign I'd served in. I didn't orchestrate anything dramatic. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I engineered some elaborate trap isn't the truth. What I did was smaller, and quieter, and, I think, more honest. I simply didn't correct Grant's assumption that I'd be attending as a spectator. I let him think I was coming the way I always came to his events, quiet, peripheral, easy to overlook. What Grant didn't know was that Colonel Osei would be there too. What Grant definitely didn't know was that the specific aircraft he'd been showing off to everyone, the one with the operational history he loved reciting like a party trick, was connected to a mission I had actually flown. I reached out to Osei ahead of time, not to ask him to do anything specific, just to let him know I'd be there and that my brother had built an entire identity around aircraft I had lived history with. Osei, who has never in his life missed an opportunity to correct an injustice when he sees one, simply said, "Good. I'll bring the file." I didn't ask him to elaborate. Some things you just let unfold. The night of the gathering, Grant was in full form. 60 guests, string lights strung across the hangar rafters, a bar cart shaped like a vintage fuel truck, and Grant at the center of it all, holding court in front of his prized restored aircraft, the one with the campaign history, telling the story of its acquisition to a small crowd that included 2 current defense contractors, a local news personality, and a Pentagon liaison officer named Major Aaron Cole, who I later learned had been specifically invited by Osei because of his current role reviewing declassified mission archives. At some point, riding a wave of confidence and a second glass of wine, Grant turned the story into a performance. "Everyone in my family thinks they know planes," he said, laughing, gesturing vaguely toward me standing near the back with Priya. "But I'm the one who actually understands them. I mean, Mara, tell me. If you were really there, name just one aircraft from that region you actually flew near." Just one. The room laughed with him, that easy, cruel laugh people give when they think they're in on a joke instead of witnessing one. I felt something very calm settle over me. Not anger, something steadier than anger. I looked past Grant, at the aircraft behind him, at the specific tail markings he'd spent an entire dinner party bragging about restoring. And I smiled, because I recognized it instantly, the way you recognize your own handwriting. "That one," I said, nodding toward the aircraft. "She flew that mission." The room didn't understand yet. Grant certainly didn't. He laughed again, started to say something dismissive, and that's when Major Cole stepped forward, folder already open, and said, quiet but clear enough to carry, "Captain Reyes is correct. That aircraft's operational history includes a mission she personally flew as part of a coalition advisory unit in that region. I have the record here, if anyone would like it read." Grant went very still. Nobody laughed this time. Osei stepped in beside Cole, arms crossed, and added, not unkindly, but without softening it either, that I had been, in his words, one of the sharpest operational minds he'd commanded in 22 years of service, and that he found it interesting he was only now hearing my own brother describe me as someone who'd never done anything with her interest in aviation. A few guests actually gasped. The local news personality had her phone out, not recording yet, just frozen. Grant's business partner, standing near the bar cart, quietly set down his drink. Major Cole, professional to the last detail, then did something I hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. He read, briefly, the unclassified summary portion of the mission record, the part cleared for exactly this kind of context, my role coordinating a critical extraction under conditions that had, at the time, been considered high risk enough to warrant a commendation I'd never once mentioned to my family, because what was the point of mentioning something nobody would believe? Grant's face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Disbelief. Something like embarrassment. Something that might have been the beginning of shame. He opened his mouth to say something, I genuinely don't think he knew what, and nothing came out. 19 years of the family's little disappointment collapsed in front of 60 witnesses, a folder, and one very inconveniently well-informed Pentagon liaison officer. Priya, standing beside me, didn't say a single word. She didn't need to. She just reached over and squeezed my hand, hard, the kind of grip that says I told you so and I'm so proud of you and I've been waiting years for this at the exact same time. Grant tried, weakly, to recover, something about not knowing the details, about classification, about how could he have known. Osei, not one for letting people off easy, simply said, "You could have asked her." And the room, 60 guests who'd laughed 30 seconds earlier, sat in a silence that said more than any of them could have. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy to. I just said, quietly enough that only Grant and Priya really heard it, "You didn't have to believe me. You just had to ask." And then I let the silence do the rest of the work, the way it had earned the right to. The weeks after that hangar gathering rearranged something in my family that I don't think will ever fully rearrange back. Word travels fast in small collector circles, and faster still in families. My mother called me 3 days later, her voice doing that careful thing it does when she's trying to sound like she isn't backpedaling 19 years of dismissiveness in a single conversation. My father sent a text that just said, "Wish you'd told us." I didn't respond to that one for a while, because the honest answer, I tried, for years, and nobody made room for it, wasn't something I wanted to type out in a text message. My career, meanwhile, kept moving in the direction it had always been moving, just now with slightly more visibility. Within the year, I was asked to step into a senior advisory position on a project coordinating between defense liaison teams and civilian aviation historians, partly because of my background, and partly, I suspect, because Osei doesn't forget people he respects. Colleagues who'd known me for years as simply Reyes, good under pressure, started learning the fuller shape of what that meant, and the respect that followed wasn't loud. It was just steady, and real, and mine. Priya and I got closer in a way that surprised both of us. She started asking better questions, and I started answering more of them, within the limits I still have to keep. We have dinner most weeks now, just the two of us, and she still, sometimes, brings up that hangar night just to watch my face when she does. "Best 10 seconds of silence I've ever witnessed," she likes to say. She's not wrong. Grant reached out about 4 months after the party. A text, careful and short, saying he'd been thinking about that night a lot, that he was sorry, that he'd like to actually understand what I'd done instead of talking over it. I read it twice. I believed, mostly, that he meant it. I wrote back something polite, something honest, that I appreciated the message, that I wasn't interested in rehashing old dinners, but that I'd be open to starting fresh if he was serious about it. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold either. It was exactly as much as 19 years of being talked over had earned him, no more. We've had a handful of careful conversations since. He still collects aircraft. I still don't talk about most of what I did. But somewhere in that hangar, under string lights and in front of 60 strangers, my brother finally learned the difference between owning a piece of history and having lived one. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's this: you don't owe anyone a performance of your worth just because they've decided they already know the whole story. Sometimes the truth doesn't need you to argue for it. It just needs a folder, a room full of witnesses, and the patience to wait for someone qualified enough to read it out loud. If this story hit home for anybody who's ever been the quiet one in a loud family, tell me about it in the comments, and if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another file waiting to be read.